Today, we're starting to get into the book more. And if you remember, I asked you a question. I said, will the Antichrist rule be worldwide? And I asked you if you had commentaries or materials to check to see what you come up with. So did anyone come up with anything?
Yes, it will be worldwide.
It will be worldwide. Worldwide.
They're going to cry peace, and he's going to bring peace, at least false peace.
Okay, anyone else?
I've been questioning it lately because where it says that there was worldwide rule of Babylon, Greece, etc. It wasn't worldwide, but it was certainly that world.
It was hyperbole,
Yeah.
which is very prevalent in the Mid-Eastern countries.
No, that's the kings.
And so that's what we want to see.
The question I have, Pastor, because the last couple of Sundays you were saying that everything is in the area on the map. So worldwide to them is that world, isn't it? It isn't anything else.
That's all the world they knew at that time. Probably. Except for what the Lord gave by the Spirit and named the country.
Okay, as we've seen throughout the study this far, the scriptures repeatedly and abundantly specify the nations that are reserved for judgment when God or when Jesus returns. And the Lord's chastisement is always pointing us to the regions or nations that surrounding Israel. Now, many prophecy teachers today claim that the religion of the Antichrist will be humanism and are some form of an all-inclusive religion. If this is the case, then one must also believe that the overwhelming majority of Middle Eastern nations today will convert from Islam to a belief system common in the West, but embraced by very few in the Middle East. Do you understand what I'm saying? Many prophecy teachers claim that the religion of the Antichrist will be something that the worldwide or whole world will accept. If this is the case, we must believe then the overwhelming majority of the Muslim nations that surround Israel will convert to some form of religion that the Antichrist approves. But nowhere in Scripture do we have anything to back that up. Not once in the entire Bible is an exclusively European nation actually named in the context of judgment on the day of the Lord. Now, the Bible references from time to time European nations, but remember, in the context of the judgment that we have seen over and over and over, it's Edom, Moab, Mount Seir, Jordan, Ephraim, all of these nations, which is the ones that it says that God's wrath is going to fall upon. Yet this is where the majority of prophecy teachers have told us the Antichrist and his empire will emerge from the old Roman Empire. So what shall we conclude then? I think we need to take the Scriptures, stay with what the Scripture says, and will not go wrong. When it mentions such names as Edom, Moab, Cush, Arabia, Assyria, Libya, Lydia, or Persia, they are the prophecy teachers that teach that he's coming from a European nation, say, well, this is just a reference to several nations which encompasses all of the European world. But nowhere does Scripture say that. It doesn't bear that out. See, this is a hyper-allegorical approach, and is very common when approaching these passages of Scripture. But I find that we need to take a conservative and literal interpretation of the Scriptures wherever it is possible. So in the next 2 chapters that we'll be studying, we will attempt to answer the questions and develop a solid method of interpretation to understand these passages. Now let's get back to the dominion of the Antichrist. Is it absolute or is it limited? Now, as we have reviewed a sampling of prophetic text that specify where the emphasis of God's judgment is going to fall when Jesus returns, one point stands out. The overwhelming emphasis of the Lord's anger and judgment is directed towards the hostile nations that surround Israel, which basically are all Islamic nations. Now, while many of the prophecies that we have studied so far had a partial fulfillment in their day, yet they all had an ultimate day of the Lord context, where the full fulfilling of the prophecy is to take place. Much of the church believes that the coming kingdom of the Antichrist will include every single nation of the earth, no matter how specific the Scriptures are in naming the primary nations that are reserved for the Lord's judgment. Therefore, whether one views the coming kingdom of the Antichrist to be absolutely global or limited will significantly determine our interpretation of the rest of the book of Revelation. Within the realm of theology, every belief affects some other belief. It is therefore essential to determine what the Scriptures truly say about this issue. Will the coming kingdom literally include every single nation on earth? Or will it be limited in some way? Now let me say, if you carry the idea that it is going to be complete, in no way diminishes your study of the Scripture, because there is thousands upon thousands of people that believe that way. And I can understand how they come to that conclusion. But it's because we, in the Western world, try to put a Western view upon an Eastern writing. The belief that the Antichrist kingdom will be global and unlimited is held by a wide range of prophecy teachers. Some of you may have read some of Dr. Thomas Ice's book, for instance. He says the revived Roman Empire will come to power via a 10-nation confederacy. This will be the springboard for the Antichrist global empire. David Regan, another prophecy teacher, expresses a similar belief concerning the Antichrist's absolute authority over every government, military, and religious system in every nation of the earth, without exception. And this is what he states: the final Gentile empire will unite the world politically, socially, economically, and spiritually. Every nation will be included. Now, as shocking as it may be to many, the Bible does not predict an absolute global empire controlled by the Antichrist. Now, stay with me, and I think we can prove to you from Scripture that what I just said is true. The Scriptures does not predict an entire global world controlled by the Antichrist. While there are a few verses that have led many to take such a view, there are also several other important texts that make this an impossibility. After a thorough examination of all the relevant passages of Scripture that pertain to the issue, I think it will become quite clear what the Bible predicts is a vastly powerful, yet limited empire controlled by the Antichrist. So now let's consider the evidence. But the Antichrist empire is primarily a 10-nation alliance. You say, Pastor, that's just what we said. The old Roman Empire, no. They don't teach in Roman Empire. But the Antichrist empire is primarily a 10-nation alliance. Number one, the repeated emphasis the Bible places on the Antichrist kingdom is 10 nations. The first such passage is found in Daniel 7. I'm going to give you time to turn to Daniel 7. And this speaks of the future empire, which is symbolized through the image of a beast. So Daniel 7, this empire that Daniel is speaking about would follow the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, and Grecian empires. And being a powerful, destructive force that would utterly trample the regions it conquered. This is verse 7 of Daniel 7. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now after this, an angel informed Daniel that the 10 horns represented what? 10 kings or 10 kingdoms, which would arise from this fourth kingdom, which was diverse from all the rest. And I believe the leader of these 10 kings is the Antichrist. Verses 24 and 25 of Daniel 7. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and wear out the saints of the Most High. Now, John the Apostle also relayed the same information in the book of Revelation. In fact, between these two books, Daniel and Revelation, the Lord stated the specific number of nations that will initially comprise the Antichrist empire. 8 separate times. Daniel 7, 24 and 25 says about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up before, which 3 of them fell, the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than its companions. Now notice there were 10 horns on this beast that Daniel saw. There was 10 kings, it says. And then there was another little horn came up, and he devoured 3 of the horns. In other words, there was 3 of these 10 nations that wouldn't go along with him, wouldn't accept him as their anointed Messiah, and so he annihilated them. So the little horn that came up was had the eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than his companions. That is the Antichrist kingdom. That's the Antichrist kingdom. So let's go to Revelation 13, verse 1. Revelation 13, 1. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its head. And in verse 3 of Revelation 17, and he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. Now this is John writing. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names. It had 7 heads and 10 horns. Verse 7 of Revelation 17. But the angel said unto me, why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman, and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. And verse 12 of 17. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power. Now that's what Daniel said, wasn't it? But they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. Now when it says 1 hour there, it means a very short time. It doesn't mean 60 minutes. As the words that are used here, 1 hour, is to denote in the Eastern way of speaking a very short time. Verse 16 of Revelation 17. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. Now all of these passages demonstrate the weight of emphasis the Lord has so obviously placed on the number 10. 10 as the number of nations that would be the willing supporters of the Antichrist. Now I know this may go a little bit across the grain, but stay with me, because if we follow the Scripture to its conclusion, we're going to see that what we have been taught for years and years and years is not what the Bible teaches. Now this does not mean that the Antichrist kingdom will always include only 10 nations, never to expand. But as our study continues, we will see that from this 10-nation base of the willing followers of the Antichrist, Antichrist will expand his empire through military conquest. Now, if he were a worldwide ruler, why would he be fighting? Why would he be warring?
Because he's trying to make them his ruler.
Yeah, but see, if he was already a worldwide ruler, well, that's not hard for me to say. He will expand his base through war. But it will be a limited military expansion of the Antichrist dominion, as we'll see from Bible passages that we'll read. Several Bible passages very directly address the military expansion of the Antichrist empire. But according to Daniel's vision, according to John's vision in Revelation, it's a 10-nation confederacy from which the Antichrist comes. And there's 3 in that 10-nation confederacy that's going to rebel right off of the bat. That's why it says he uprooted 3 of the horns, got rid of them. And so then we'll find that the Antichrist will conquer many nations. The Bible is clear on this. But what is also clear that the Antichrist will never literally conquer or control every last nation on the earth. Let's consider the evidence. Twice in Daniel, the 11th chapter, it says that the Antichrist will invade many countries. Let's read Daniel 11, verse 16. And this is talking about the king of the north and the king of the south fighting against the other. And it says, but he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will. None shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. Now this is talking about the Antichrist fighting against the king of the north. And he says the king of the north doesn't have a chance. The Antichrist is going to overcome him. But specifically, if we go on and read in verse 16 of Daniel 11, we will find that Egypt will fall to his forces. But beyond this, we are told the Antichrist will invade the land of Israel, called the glorious land. So he is going to conquer some, in addition to the 10 that he started out with. But this passage also may suggest to us that the Antichrist will not conquer every nation, because it specifically says that Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will escape his hand. That can't be any plainer than that, can it?
And where is that?
I believe it's in Daniel, but
Okay.
I didn't write that down. I should have. At the time I wrote it, I knew what it meant.
Okay.
Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will escape his hand. Daniel 11th chapter, verses 40 and 42. And he shall come into countries and overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall. But these shall be delivered out of his hand. Oh, here it is. That's Daniel 11th chapter.
41.
Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. Now, when this passage speaks of the nations that fall to the Antichrist, military expansion, it says many countries, not every nation. Many countries, not every nation. And then it specifically lists 3 ancient kingdoms that will be delivered out of his hand. Daniel 11th chapter, verse 41. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. Now, because of this grouping here of Edom, Moab, and Ammon together, the passage seems to be referring to the modern day kingdom of Jordan, because Edom and Moab are both located in Jordan. And so based on this passage, it may be that Jordan will not come under the complete authority of the Antichrist. But it could also mean that Jordan will not be crushed. In other words, there'll be a partial surrender, a partial giving in, but instead of willingly submitting to the Antichrist, they will say, well, you know, I'm sitting down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside. In other words, they're going to be resistant. But as we will see, there are certainly other nations that will not fall under his dominion. Just a few verses later, we learn that in the midst of his campaign of conquest, the Antichrist hears of news from the east and the north, which trouble him and throw him into a frantic state of rage and annihilation. Now, if he ruled the whole world, why would news from the north and the east upset him? Because there's some nations that we got to take care of this guy. And so they're marching, and he gets word that they're coming down. And because the context of the whole of this passage is military conquest, it's easy to see that the news that he gets is that, hey, we've got some rebels on our hand. And it is likely that the news is a reference to the gathering military response against the Antichrist. In Daniel 11th chapter, verses 44 to 45, news from the east and the north shall alarm him. He shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. What is the glorious holy mountain?
Probably Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Yet he shall come to his end, and none to help him. Many commentators have suggested that China to the east and Russia to the north is the ones that he receives word that are marching against him. That could be, although we cannot know for sure. But prophecy experts and scholar John Walvoord says that the Antichrist will hear reports of additional armies coming from the east and the north. And this apparently, he says, refers to the greatest army from the east, described in Revelation 16:12 as the kings from the east. Some connect this also with Revelation 9:13-16, which states the army is 200 million strong. Now, for years and years, people say, who in the world can raise an army of 200 million?
Russia and China both. They always said China.
China has a militia of 200 million men. Now, we can conclude from that that includes not only the fighting men, but probably the supporting ones, all of the cooks and the maintenance personnel and all of the things that go in it. So, but anyway, right up to the end, we see that Antichrist will be at war with many nations. So if he ruled the world, he wouldn't be at war with them. Daniel 9:26 also establishes this reality. And the people of the prince who is come, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. I'm sorry. Prince is the people of the Antichrist. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. So simply stated, a king with absolute universal authority is not at war. The presence of wars established the fact that the Antichrist does not control every nation, but that there are resisting governments. He does not control their military. This is true for the Antichrist's limited authority right up to the end. Now, I will get into just in a few moments, see that even though his rule is not worldwide, probably all of us in the world, to some degree, will be affected by the rule of the Antichrist. And we'll explain that as we get a little further along here. Now, Finis, Jennings Dake accurately states this. It says, no earthly man will become the worldwide dictator before Christ comes to reign. Thus, the old theory of the Antichrist being a man who will miraculously bring world peace and prosperity is unscriptural. He's a man of war from the time he comes until he's destroyed at Armageddon. Because as soon as the 10 horns will come up, the 10 kingdoms that will be formed out of this Islamic nations around east, south, and north of Israel, he immediately is in war with 3 of them, kicks them out right away because they evidently question his authority. And he is a man of war from the time that he comes until he's destroyed at Armageddon. But despite the fact the Antichrist's dominion will be limited, his military apparatus will be a force to be reckoned with. In fact, in Revelation 13, and we see the people of the earth asking, who is able to make war against the Antichrist? It would seem as if none are capable of waging war against him. Revelation 13:4 says they worship the dragon, for he had given authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who can fight against him? Now, if every nation were under the rule of the Antichrist, that question could not be asked. Now, remember in our early studies, we said that much of the Bible is written in hyperbole, which is an intentional exaggeration to make a point stick in your mind. It's not meant to be taken literally. And much of the Bible is written in hyperbole because it was written basically to the Jewish and about the Jewish people. So it was written with them in mind, and they would understand exactly what it would say. Hyperbole is obvious and intentional exaggeration, an extravagant statement or figure of speech not intended to be taken literally, as to wait for an eternity. Have you ever told someone you meet them at 3 o'clock? They come 3:15, they wasn't there. 3:30, they wasn't there. 3:45, they wasn't there. And when they show up, I've waited for you all day. Or I've waited for you for an eternity. That's hyperbole. To accurately interpret biblical prophecy, it's essential to understand hyperbole and its frequent use throughout the Scripture. It's an exaggeration used to create emphasis. And it's used in everyday casual speech. Many of you don't even realize you use it probably. But suppose Charlotte's little grandson comes over to her house, and she hasn't seen him for a week or so, and she tries to pick him up. She says, oh my goodness, you weigh a ton. That's hyperbole. He doesn't weigh anywhere near a ton. But it just simply means that he's growing, he's putting on weight. Of course, the boy actually weighs far less than 2,000 pounds. Okay. The Middle Eastern culture that gave birth to the Bible is particularly fond of hyperbole. And because the Bible uses the idioms, anyone tell me what an idiom is? idioms? Slang?
Figures of speech.
An idiom is an expression whose meaning is not predictable from the usual meaning of its constituent elements. Let me give you an example. When somebody dies, you say he kicked the bucket. You mean that he died. He's gone. You didn't mean he went out and was kicking the bucket up and down the road. Or, how about hanging one's head? Not a rope around your neck hanging. You're shameful or you're sorrowful or something, and you hang your head. So, let me take this a step further. In discussing his native Syrian culture, Abraham Rabbani, in his classic work, The Syrian Christ, recalls a somewhat humorous example of hyperbole is used in everyday Middle Eastern countries. It says he went to visit a friend of his, and this is what transpired. His friend says, you have extremely honored me by coming into my abode. I am not worthy of it. This house is yours. You may burn it if you wish. My children also are at your disposal. I would sacrifice them all for your pleasure. Now, to the Western mind, that may seem gross to us, but in Eastern culture, it's simply everyday use. Of course, this man would not have allowed his friend to burn down his house, nor to burn or to, nor was he offering his children to be sacrificed. This flamboyant language was simply a normal way in Middle Eastern culture to express great honor and welcome to revenge. So let's look at some hyperbole examples in Scripture. Let's briefly consider a few passages of Scripture where hyperbole is used. Now, many places, but we're just going to take a few this morning. In pondering the difficulties of entering the Promised Land, the Hebrews expressed their dismay, not only at the size of the people in the land, but also the walls that surrounded their city. And if you'd like to turn to Deuteronomy 1:28, or make a note of it to read it later, Deuteronomy 1:28. Now remember that the children of Israel had crossed the Jordan, and they were camped outside the walls of Jericho. And so this is what some of them said. Where are we going up? Our brothers has made our hearts melt. The people are greater and taller than we. The cities are great and fortified up to heaven. And besides, we have seen the sons of the Anakim there. And so did the walls of the city literally reach to heaven? How high is heaven? 100 feet? 200 feet?
Well, there's several heavens.
1,000 feet? Is heaven? Of course the walls were not literally fortified up to heaven. They were just intimidatingly high. That is all that this expression means. 2 Chronicles 1:15, another example of hyperbole. And the king, speaking of King Solomon, the king made silver and gold as common in Jerusalem as stone. And he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of the Shephelah. I cannot speak to the amount of cedars or sycamore trees in the Shephelah during Solomon's day, but I can guarantee you there was gazillions of stones in the area. Gazillions of stones in the area. To suggest that silver and gold were literally as abundant and common in Israel as stones is just plain silly. It's hyperbole. The point is that during Solomon's reign, wealth was abundant in Israel. Numerous other examples could be cited. It is beyond question that the Bible frequently uses hyperbole. But even more relevant to our larger discussion, the Bible repeatedly uses hyperbole, especially with regards to the extent of the various pagan empires. This is absolutely critical to note if one desires to properly interpret the passages that speak of the extent of the Antichrist coming kingdom. Despite the fact that these passages we've read and many others reveal that there will be at least some nations not under the Antichrist authority. Some Bible students have looked at passages such as Daniel 7:23 as proof of his universal authority. As for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down, and break it in pieces. Now, these students of the Scripture immediately assume that the phrase, the whole earth, literally means every single nation across the globe. But there is no difficulty or contradiction with this verse and a limited dominion of the Antichrist. The phrase, the whole earth, is the Aramaic, and I can't pronounce Aramaic, so I'll spell it for you, K-O-L-A-R-A. The whole earth is this word here. And it's appropriately understood here as a large but limited section of land. And commenting on this particular verse, Gleason Archer Jr., perhaps the chief apostle of the doctrine of biblical inerrancy and a well-known translator and scholar of biblical language, states this: the whole earth that's used here is not K-O-L-A-R-A, but it's K-O-L-D-R-D, a different word, and refers not to all known parts of the inhabited earth, but rather to the entire territory of the Near East, the nations surrounding Israel, and to the Holy Land. So you see, the word that's used even disputes that the Antichrist kingdom will be complete. Because the different word, if the whole earth, if it was the whole earth, and we'll get to this in a minute, it would say cosmos. Okay, let's go. Our time's fast getting away up. Find a place to stop right here. You see, the word used, that last word we said, depending on the context in which it's used, might mean a single country in the land of Israel, or a larger geographical unit such as a territorial region, but never the whole world. And Daniel 2:39 uses this exact Aramaic phrase of the Alexandrian Empire. In Daniel 2:39. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze shall rule over all the earth. Again, it's limited by the word that is used there, of all. No historian would ever claim that the Grecian Empire actually ruled the entire planet. They didn't. In fact, the maps that you've got, if you look at the Greek Empire, you'll see that it covered a large portion of territory, but it did not ever rule the whole world. So in claiming that the whole earth in Daniel 7:23 literally means the whole earth, one must ignore the meaning of the words in their original language, both here and in Daniel. And in 239, Alexander the Great did not rule every last nation on the earth. So I'm going to have to stop right there because our timer's gone. Any questions or comments?
The word that you used, the idiom?
Idiom, I,
Well, it means exaggeration.
hyperbole.
Hyperbole.
Mhm.
That we would use exaggeration today, right?
Right. It's a intentional exaggeration to make a point. In other words, it's important. I want you to get this in your mind. I want you to understand that this is important. Anyone else? As we get on to the end of this a little deeper, you'll see that just scripture after scripture bears out the fact that the Antichrist kingdom is going to be limited.
With all the electronics and everything in the world today, it's bound to affect the whole world, but not
This
as,
will be brought out.
not as king or
You'll never control the militaries of every nation. If you did, there would be no war. And it says there will be war to the very end. And so that, as we look at these scriptures, I believe we'll decide that the Bible is true and what we've been taught for years and years was not false, in the sense that they set out to deceive us. They simply did not take into consideration the Eastern language of the Bible. hyperbole, idioms, and there's some others, I can't think of them right off, but we'll see as we get into this, and we'll continue through the scriptures, that it's a limited empire, although don't get complacent and think, well, the Antichrist is not going to affect us in America. Yes, he will. If Morsi in Egypt can affect us, Antichrist can affect us. Yeah. So we need to stay on our toes. We need to know what the scripture says. And,
We need to be ready for the rapture
Right.
to avoid all this.
right.
Pastor, there was one other thing, in 1 John 4, verse 3, he says that the Antichrist is already here.
The spirit of the Antichrist is
Yeah.
already at work in this
Yes.
world. Now, the spirit of the Antichrist. In other words, the Antichrist spirit is lust, power, wealth, dominion. These are
Control.
things. Hmm?
Control.
Control, yeah. And that's what all of this saber rattling is about, is control. And getting the wealth of the country into possession of the country that's warring against them. Lord bless you, thanks for being here. And I hope that you'll study the scriptures on your own and see that what we're telling you, the scripture says, not my interpretation.